I'm delighted to announce two guests today, Daniel Kube, the CEO of ServicePath, and Frank Cespedes, a professor at Harvard who teaches entrepreneurship. He's also owned his own business and he's written 6 books on sales. His most recent book, Sales Management That Works, How to Sell in a World That Never Stops Changing, is going to be one of the topics that we talk about today. Without further ado, for taking the time to speak with us today.
Well, thank you very much. The timing for me is perfect, and it's a pleasure to be with you at ServicePath.
Thanks, Frank. So you've written a lot about sales, and like we said in your background, you've been doing this for a long time. So there's a lot of things that have changed, and probably a lot of things that haven't over the last decade. Tell us a little bit about, take your point of view and what's changed, what hasn't with COVID, accelerations, dispel myths.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, the most important thing about selling is and always has been buying. Who buys, why, and how. And that's really where the big changes are occurring. We're living through a sustained data revolution that will continue throughout our careers and lifetimes. And clearly, we're living in a world where online and offline interact as well. And that's having a big change on buyers and the buying process. As a general rule, by the third decade of the 21st century, it is not a digital eats physical world. I think that's a gross misunderstanding of what's happening, but it is an omni-channel buying world that demands a multi-channel go-to-market. And that has a number of very, very big implications. One of them is that salespeople are not going away. I mean, look at the data. The number of salespeople in North America has increased consistently throughout the 21st century, even as bandwidth has increased. So that's a myth. If you look at e-commerce, even at the height of the pandemic, as a percentage of retail sales, was only about 15%, and it's gone down every quarter in the last year as more and more of us get vaccinated. But that change in buying affects sales management requirements and, quite honestly, what it means to try to pursue a career as a sales leader. One example is you've just got less time in a number of dimensions. You have less customer contact time. And in addition, I think what the pandemic has demonstrated to many companies is that, in effect, they were overpaying for many tasks in their sales models. It turns out we don't need the most expensive enterprise salespeople to do lead generation. We can do a lot of that through less expensive people or even algorithms. There are many demos you can do online, etc. I don't think that's going to go away after the pandemic. And I would add, and I know we're here to, talk about my book, and trust me, I am deeply appreciative of that. But I would add that in that new world, what firms like ServicePath and others do to make better use of the decreased amount of time that sales people have is very, very important. Accelerating quote to cash, making sure you've got the right data in the right time. That's increasingly what a large part of good sales management is about.
Daniel, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, just a couple of comments, having read Frank's book and several of your articles. Just, you talk about how the role of salespeople have changed dramatically over the past 15 years, whereas, 20 years ago, salespeople weren't marketers. They were just calling, following up. And these blurring lines and boundaries have massively changed for salespeople. If you also overlay that with the current war on talent for developers, but also sales operations, salespeople, the lines are blurring where salespeople are doing way more than they've ever done before. So they're doing marketing on the front end, and expert systems, the outreach, and things like HubSpot are really helping enable these tools and people to do more. But at the same time, where we play and we're seeing a real shift is, the ability for salespeople now to become more financial experts because the governance layers are embedded in these systems, in addition to the technology or sort of sales engineering roles. So, you talk a lot about in some of your articles about the Michelangelos and the Leonardos, and everyone wants them. But, are you a proponent of saying, expert systems can really help address some of these challenges? And where should you be worried not to rely too heavily on these expert systems, because they do accelerate, but do we lose imagination and the ability to create if we start relying on these algorithms per se?
Yeah, no, I mean, great question. But I think, Daniel, as you know, there are a couple of questions embedded in that. One is about hiring in sales, which is never easy, and to your point, getting tougher. The other is about what's happening to sales roles. And here I agree with you. There is a blurring. And then the third is, what does the data revolution mean for sales leaders in particular? Let me just say a few things about each of those. The first thing to recognize is that there always have been inherent challenges in hiring in sales that simply do not exist to the same extent in any other business function. I mean, for example, if you want to hire an engineer, you can go to a school, and it's a little bit like walking into a food court. I mean, what are you interested in? Electrical engineering, chemical engineering, mechanical engineering? You want someone in finance and accounting? You can find people who majored in those subjects. Same is true for computer programmers. But last time I looked, which was about 3 years ago when I started this book, of the nearly 5,000 colleges and universities in North America, less than 300 even offered a sales course, let alone a sales program. So this is an area where most people start out knowing almost nothing about what they're going to get paid for. And that in turn leads to other facts about this function, the amount of money that is spent on sales training, etc. It is also getting tougher to hire in sales. And by the way, the data supports this. The data in the second decade of the 21st century will show you that so-called ramp-up time is getting longer. It takes longer to hire salespeople. And that in turn is because of what you quite rightly alluded to, and that is sales tasks in many ways are expanding. For example, there is now a blurring between activities that as recently as a decade ago would clearly have been in marketing's domain, but now because of tools like HubSpot or others are things that sales can do, lead gen, content marketing, etc. A big issue facing many organizations is whether, to be blunt, their sales organizations know what the hell they're doing when they do traditional marketing activities. But that blurring is occurring, and that in turn affects sales competencies. And then the third thing is this: as a general rule, getting again back to what technology and other things are doing about buying, as a general rule, companies are now more transparent to their customers and prospects. And what I mean by that is that customers and prospects, because of online technologies, can now touch many different parts of the selling organization much easier than they could only a few years ago. Now, this has an impact on sales and sales leaders in two ways. One is it makes sales inherently more of a cross-functional activity. Sales and successful sales has always been an organizational outcome. It depends on product, price, service, not just the smarts of the salesperson, but that's getting to be a bigger and bigger issue. And one of the reasons is because when the customer has an issue, what research tells us is that 80+% of the time, they tend to call the person who sold them the product or service in the first place. So whether or not this is part of the job description, it becomes the de facto responsibility of the salesperson to go back into their organization, cross the various functional boundaries, and solve the issue. And anyone who's ever run a company, I did for 11 years, Daniel, you do now, as they say in the gangster movies, you chose this life. But anybody who's ever run a company knows that every function starts to develop its own procedures. Crossing those boundaries is not easy. This also affects sales leaders. And this, for your viewers, this is my message to people, less than 40 who are, expect to make their career in sales. Sales as a function historically was more or less a black box. I mean, I've been on boards, and the anecdote I'm about to relay, I've experienced 3 times. Sales leader has to make a presentation to the board, does that. Then the board goes into executive session. And that's where board members really speak. And 3 times I've been on boards where essentially the executive discussion was, well, I'm not sure the sales leader, really understood the question. Not sure she understands how we expect to increase enterprise value here, but she makes their numbers every quarter. Let's leave them alone. Those days are disappearing fast. Finance now gets the data, and finance people ask questions. The requirements for financial literacy in sales are increasing dramatically. And while I love sales, I've made my career there, most salespeople are not going to win financial literacy awards. They can tell you about top-line motion, but many of them have a hard time even understanding what return on invested capital is, let alone all the other questions that finance people quite rightly ask of the enormous amounts of money they spend on sales hiring, training and development, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, lots of changes there, and they do center around people and their competencies as usual in business.
So I'd love to expand on that a bit, Frank, just with your insight. So, the financial literacy is a challenge, especially in, B2B sales, where the tickets can be so much larger than, the B2C world. And, once again, that rise of the expert system, are the current systems adequate? Are we moving in the right direction with leveraging technologies like, quote to cash and configure price quote solutions? Where are we missing the boat? If we are missing the boat.
Well, I'm going to be a bit of a dissenter. I'm a bit of a contrarian here when it comes to this topic. And let me add, with my academic colleagues as well as in practice, I think part of the problem with the current talk about whatever it is, artificial intelligence, expert systems, or my favorite phrase, digital transformation, right? What a wonderful phrase. You can drive a truck through that phrase. They're vague. They're put in place basically not really to point to some actionable managerial reality. They're put in place because in the fight for, quote, my fair share of a limited budget in a company, I'm going to hitch my pitch to whatever is the next big thing. And right now it tends to revolve around these things. So the first thing I would say is, if you're in sales, finance, or, a CEO who really cares about their capital budget, you've got to demand that your people clarify and define what they mean when they use phrases like that. When someone tells me they can accelerate quote to cash, I get that. I understand what that means for my selling cycle. I understand what that means for my working capital management. But if I'm perfectly honest, and at this stage in my career, I got nothing to lose with honesty, most of what I read about expert systems and digital this and digital that is coming in from some Platonic abstraction. So that's comment number one. Until, managers get paid to get real, and until they start to specify some of the cause and effect links they're trying to fix with technology, I, for one, when I'm on boards, am not willing to write the check, right? The second thing I will say is it's very important to understand that in business in general, and in sales in particular, Data and algorithm is never the same thing as the answer to a management issue. Now, data and the algorithm are very, very important. If you think you can manage in the third decade of the 21st century without good data, without something that gives you a little bit of an edge in decreasing the uncertainty going forward, good luck. But that strikes me as dinosaur thinking. But at the end of the day, in any changing marketplace, data is about what happened. And that's not what you and others get paid for. You don't get paid to manage yesterday. You get paid to manage today and tomorrow. And by definition, data is about what already happened. Management decisions are about going forward decisions. So I think that's important. But then the third thing is my experience with organizations, and I don't have to pretend to be humble about this. My experience with organizations around the world is as good as anyone. I mean, I get around. In general, the issue is not lack of data. The issue is the proliferation of little factoids that most of the time are interesting but marginal comments about the business, as opposed to things that really move the meter in our selling cycle or our pricing or our ability to select and manage accounts. And in business, there's almost always an 80-20 rule. Manage that 20% that makes the bigger difference. And right now, data is too often about lots of little interesting but marginal things. So again, as I say, I'm a bit of a contrarian when it comes to this topic.
So I'd love your perspective, because in your book, I mean, we at ServicePath are big believers in understanding your cost of serve, especially for truly complex things, because then you can do the analysis to put your data together to understand the impact. And we talk about this concept of good revenue, which means a good deal that's accretive to the organization, that's technically compliant and financially compliant. In your book, you say most people don't understand cost of serve in organizations, and that's having a negative impact on their future. Can you illuminate on that?
Yeah, I mean, let's think about some financial basics in a business. I mean, one of the things I learned from running a business 11 years, teaching at a good business school, working literally with hundreds of really pretty well-run companies around the world, I've learned how far you can get in business if you can do the basics a little bit better than the next person, all right? Doing the basics well is what earns you the right to worry about the fancy stuff, in my opinion. And when it comes to basics, let's sort of think about this. In most companies, and when I say most, I mean in excess of 80%, in most companies, the single biggest driver of cash in and cash out is the selling cycle, right? Accounts payable tend to accrete as you're chasing customers and prospects, and then accounts receivables tend to come in when you've made the sale. As a result, cost to serve, which is very often a function of the selling cycle, but also other things, is a very, very big deal. Now, why don't most companies have a good handle on that? Basically, two reasons. One is accounting systems. Most accounting systems, especially in multi-product companies, tend to work on the basis of what accountants call peanut butter allocations. I don't know if you know that jargon, but how do you make a peanut butter sandwich? You put down a bunch of peanut butter and then smooth it evenly. That's the way accounting systems tend to allocate overhead, especially, by the way, in increasingly software-driven businesses, and that systematically obscures the real cost to serve, the real economic value or lack of value of different customers. And the second reason that this is not good knowledge in many companies is because of sales compensation systems. I mean, the number I'm about to cite has been remarkably consistent throughout my career. On any given year, it'll vary by maybe 5%. But if you look at the variable portion of sales compensation in companies around the world and ask yourself, if I'm a salesperson, how do I max out on that incentive comp? In 70% of comp plans, the answer is very simple. It's all about top line volume, not the profitability of that sale, not the cost to serve that customer, not the gross margin or price that I sell at, but simply how much volume I bring in. Now, in a comp plan like that, the message to the sales force is very clear. There is no such thing as a bad customer. Go forth and multiply. And that's exactly what reps do. Reps always understand, in my experience, within 2 weeks, how their comp plan works. And they bring in very diverse customers, very different costs to serve. And in turn, that has a domino effect on the selling organization. It deeply fragments their business model. So to the extent that we now, as I think you do at ServicePath, again, I'm happy to say this, I think you add value here, tremendous value to your clients. To the extent you help companies get a better fix on what their cost to serve different segments and different accounts is, that makes a big deal. And in my experience, it's usually a big aha to the people running sales and running the company. In turn, it affects deployment. It affects compensation. It affects, because of who we now sell to, product development. Very big deal.
A thought maybe to unpack that a little bit, Frank. So you talk about cost to serve with so much capital flowing around in the market right now. You have a view that you sit on boards. So what does that look like for people to make sure that they're getting a good return on their capital? What types of things do they need to be looking at, above operational improvements?
Well, I mean, I think, as always, customers are not created equal. In any business that has a strategy, all right? And by the way, many businesses don't. But one of the things I've learned over the years sitting on boards and working with companies is that despite the literally hundreds and hundreds of books and articles about strategy, many executives, when they talk strategy and you cut through the rhetoric, are basically saying, let's pick a big number and go for it. And unfortunately, business strategy is a little more complicated than that. But if you do have a strategy, by definition, you're making it harder for certain customers to do business with you and easier for other customers to do business with you. It's important that we understand who those customers are. Are they the ones that are not only important today in this industry, but also tomorrow? So I think that's one of the ways you get return on invested capital. The other, I think, is to make sure you understand how that works in your particular business. And I don't think a good model right now is many of the tech firms that are basically, living off sugar daddies, right? That's what we call venture capital firms who, don't care about profitability. If you don't care about profitability, you don't care about return on invested capital. It's really a very small minority of businesses that can, essentially operate on the basis of we don't care about losses because, there's going to be a big a payoff 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 7 years from now. The reality for most businesses when it comes to their finances is, look, if you don't survive the short term, you don't have to worry about the long term. So that's the second thing. Make sure we understand what drives invested capital. And then the third, because sales is such a crucial function in any business. I mean, again, step back, think about the basics. So many other resource allocations in any company depend upon demand forecasts and the sales force's ability to actually achieve those forecasts. That's why it's such a central function. And as a result, and this is again where sales management I think, is under, quite rightly, increasing pressure. As a result, you can do all the other things I said, understand return on invested capital, understand why it's important. But if this isn't reflected in your performance management processes and metrics and sales, then you should teach in a university. You shouldn't be an executive, right? I get paid to diagnose. Folks like you get paid to actually do it. There's a big difference.
It's just I have to interject. One of my early mentors in my career, his quote to me is, "You know what a long-term strategy is? It's a short-term strategy that doesn't work." And just I always remember that.
Well, I mean, but your mentor was making a good point. I mean, again, in philosophy, it really is a genuine issue. If a tree falls in the forest and there was no one there to hear it, was there a sound? Lots of great thinkers, have different points of view about that. But in business, we know the answer to that question. There was no sound. All right. A good idea that can't be executed in the right time frame is called failure in business. So I think your mentor was making, I think, a very, very valid point.
Frank, one question is talking about, how, organizations and things have changed and some things remain the same. You mentioned earlier that, salespeople aren't going away. And in your book, you also illuminate on, how everyone thought COVID was going to drive your quote unquote digital transformation and sales would change overnight and salespeople were going away. And I think the data speaks very differently based on what you've shared. But do you see organizations becoming more alike? Because everyone now is relying on the cloud. Everyone's putting their systems in the cloud. Like former manufacturing organizations are now looking like technology organizations because they're doing a lot of, the robotics are all driven in the cloud. They're stacking solutions together that have very similar cost structures. How do you think that's going to change sales and the way we should entertain the future of B2B enterprise sales?
Yeah, well, I mean, a few things, Daniel. I mean, obviously, technology, you don't need jargon like the Internet of Things, I think, to understand this brute fact about advanced economies. Obviously, technology, software is being embedded in all kinds of products, all right? So I think in that sense, there is a technological revolution occurring in business. I think IT, because of the cloud, gets more light, all right? And by the way, in my opinion, that's way overdue. I mean, the amount of money companies were spending on IT and servers and other things, I think what the data suggests from good economists, at least through the 20th century, it was a net drain, not a net gain. The cloud here is a good thing. So while IT gets more light, I think the rest of the business model depends on the business model. And sales, I think, is a good example of this. As a general rule, I think most of what you're hearing about these so-called new normal predictions coming out of the pandemic are more or less nonsense. They're based on zero empirical data. They're somebody's opinion based on the little bit of what they see. And as I've already mentioned, if you simply look at online sales and say, is that growing? Is it decreasing? Well, obviously, or at least it seems obvious to me, when stores are closed or when they're held to 25 to 50% of their capacity, when people legitimately feel that if they walk into a store, they may catch a virus and die. Obviously, there's going to be more buying and selling that occurs online, but I've already cited the data. Even under maximum lockdown conditions last year, it only increased to about 15% of total retail sales, and it's gone down every quarter since. Buying and selling in both B2C and B2B markets has always been a social as well as an economic transaction. I don't think 2 years of a pandemic is going to change that aspect of humanity, but it will change how we deploy and use people in customer contact activities like sales. And these are levers that are increasingly available to salespeople. You asked me earlier about hiring. I work with lots of companies on that topic. And when I ask most sales managers, who are you looking to hire? If you actually take their rhetoric seriously, essentially nobody except Michael Jordan or Michelangelo is going to fulfill their criteria. And my advice is always the same. Whenever you can hire a Michelangelo or a Michael Jordan, do it. You know, they're probably going to add value. But there are very, very few Renaissance men and women around, right? Most of us tend to coagulate around the midsection of the bell curve. But these are levers available to sales managers. And by the way, data makes it increasingly available. How do I deploy my salespeople? Do I really need them to do every task in the customer conversion funnel? Or, as I think the pandemic has demonstrated, in effect, I can offload some of those tasks, use less expensive, less capable people or machines to do it, and then increase the amount of time available to my really good account executives for doing this. You know, again, I'll end this with a little bit of data, but the data I'm about to cite obviously varies by company and by industry. But if you ask yourself, how much time does the average salesperson spend in customer contact? And by customer contact, I don't just mean making a pitch, either in person or virtually about your product. I mean all forms of customer contact, webinars, demos, emails. The data varies, but on average, it tends to be between 30 and 35%. All right. Now, think about what happens in a business if, because of good data analytics, deployment, etc., you can make that 40%, 45%, you know, nirvana, 50% or more. Not only is that an enormous productivity improvement in most businesses, but it also increases the addressable market of the business, because segments that were economically infeasible to reach now do become feasible when we've got better utilization in our sales force. So it's a real big opportunity for companies, and I think increasingly a core source of competitive advantage.
Yeah, I mean, Frank, that's a great plug for configure, price, quote, or quote to cash, because I mean, basically shortening the sales time or time to quote or requote is huge. But is there any, I'd be really interested, so with that, if you have 40% of your time to devote to your customer, how is that best spent with your customer to maximize outcomes?
Well, that's a question that varies. And you know, this, by the way, was one of my core motivations for writing the book that we're talking about. I mean, you know, it's not, Daniel, you know this, it's not like the world is waiting breathlessly for another book about sales. All right. I mean, if you go to Amazon and go to books and put in sales, out will come over 80,000 stock keeping units. Far as I can tell, the only management topic that gets more items at Amazon than sales is, quote, leadership. Gets about 90,000, but sales is a close second. But my motivation in writing the book is that of all the business functions, sales is by far the most context specific, right? Selling software is different than selling capital goods. It's different than selling professional services. Selling 5, 6, 7-year licensed software is different than selling SaaS, all right? It varies in North America versus Latin America or Asia. So very context specific. But sales is also that area where, for some reason, people feel most comfortable making these huge generalizations that are usually unsupported by any data, except, as we would say in academia, n equals 1. When I sold for Oracle, when we invested in PayPal. So, I think it's very important to understand that context specificity and, deal with it that way. And that's going to affect how that 40% is allocated. It will also be affected by your strategy, right? There are a number of businesses, let's think about a lot of tech SaaS businesses that because of their fundamentally VC funding, and because they believe, although my own experience about this and data, you can read about this in the book, is that this is usually way, way overestimated because of what they'll call early mover advantages. It's all about top line. Let's get top line. In that case, the 40% is probably allocated to initial customer conversion. On the other hand, there are other businesses where the real issue is land and expand. And you want your important people performing that ongoing account management task because they understand how to move from this division to the next division, from these users to the next crop of users, etc. And then there are other businesses, lots of big project businesses, capital goods businesses, where the real issue, because of the size of the deals, is making sure that we not only know how to negotiate and articulate our value proposition, but make sure the price is right, because it's going to be a multi-year project. And, one of the rules of business is you can't lose a lot of money on small accounts. If you're going to lose a lot of money, it's typically on big accounts. So that 40% will be allocated very, very differently depending on the business, its strategy. And it's up to sales leaders to understand that. In my opinion, this is one of their core responsibilities. And when they don't, my experience is they're toxic. They hurt the rest of the business. And again, the data revolution is making this increasingly visible to other leaders, other C-suite leaders in their companies.
Wow. So one question I wanted to bring up is just to the point of helping sales guys how to better understand how they spend their time, but there's also the evolution in the way people want to consume products now. So the move to as a service economy and consumption-based models and outcome-based models. How do we better arm our sales teams to embrace those, because customers are driving them and a lot of organizations don't clearly understand them, I believe.
Yeah. Well, let's one way to think about the trend you're talking about is the increase, and by the way, I think it's very important around this topic, Daniel, to go beyond tech. My experience is that people in tech, they tend to be myopic. Because they get so much attention, they tend to forget that 80% of the world is not what they're doing. All right. But if you think about subscription businesses generally, not just software, but subscription businesses generally, your generalization is supported. Even before the pandemic, those businesses were growing about 300% faster than the S&P 500. So obviously, again, most important thing about selling is buying and buyers. There is a sort of sea change in the economy about how customers prefer to buy and consume. Now, the issue is, what does this mean for sales? And again, it will vary by business, by type of subscription business. But generally speaking, I think it has a couple of implications. One is that in many of those businesses, at least in B2B, it changes who buys. It changes whether it's part of the capital budget or whether it's part of the quarter by quarter operating budget. And for many salespeople, that in turn affects who it is they have to deal with at those B2B buyers, and what kind of value proposition resonates and what kind does not. So that's number one. Number two, in many of those businesses, the real money, if there is going to be money that's made, The real money is not in that initial sale, but in moving that customer up to, either the next level of the offering, the premium offer, or whatever. And that's an important sales task. And by the way, in many companies, it's not necessarily the people that we call salespeople who are in the best position to do that. In many companies, especially many SaaS companies, the people in the best position to do that are what we call customer success. They're the ones who, because of onboarding and other things, really understand the usage patterns at that customer. And one of the, I think, major challenges facing many of those companies is how they integrate and align their sales function with their post-sale service functions. So that's number two. And then number three, as always, pricing becomes very, very important. The old saying, you only get one chance to make a first impression. And, right now, because of supply chain shocks, many companies are facing a really once in a lifetime opportunity to increase price. You've got now a socially acceptable rationale for doing that. But, in some period of time, I don't know if it's 6 months, a year, or 2 years, those supply chain issues, at least in a capitalist economy, will work their way out. But they remain very, very important issues, pricing does, in subscription businesses in general. Because again, they're going to be there for some time. And what marketers call customer lifetime value becomes the generator of profitability if it is going to be a profitable customer.
Yeah. So Frank, this has been amazing, and I know Bruce has some questions that some people have sent in. But one of the things that I really enjoyed, just a footnote for you about the book, was you helped me remember some of the things. We think SaaS is so new, but your analogy about Xerox, paper as a service, is huge. This subscription economy has been around for a long time. It just, it's ones and zeros now versus physical goods, but it was quite illuminating, and some of the challenges they faced, we are seeing today again, which is very interesting.
Well, but this is something I learned as a professor years and years ago. What goes around comes around and then comes around again. You can dust off the old notes. In business, the perennials apply.
Not only that, but I think as well, even in the beginning of your book, Frank, when you talk about car sales being displaced by salespeople, right? With 1%, I think you cited the facts with less than 1% of 40 million used cars were done without some sort of human intervention. So I would agree with that.
Yeah, but I think, but again, I think the lesson there, Bruce, is not that online technologies and the internet is therefore not a big deal, because and by the way, this has been true through the pandemic as well. I mean, if you look at online car sales, hasn't increased that much. The dealer is still the locus of that buying and selling, but that doesn't mean that online is not a big deal, and cars are a very, very good example. I think anyone who's, at least in the United States, anyone who's bought a car over the last 20 years realizes that experience has improved dramatically. And it hasn't improved dramatically because dealers went to Bible school and said, let's stop playing all these games that we typically do in dealerships. It's improved dramatically because of the internet. And again, you see the data in the book, but the average car buyer spends almost 14 hours online researching the purchase, and a total of something like 3.5 hours actually going to dealerships, but yet 96+% is still bought in the dealership. But the buyer now walks in armed with that information about product, price, etc. That in turn has quite rightly motivated dealerships to make that a better, more value-added experience when that knowledgeable buyer is in the dealership. And that's happening in lots of other categories, in B2B user forums, where people actually exchange information about the product and their usage experience. And by and large, this is a good thing. It's a good thing for society, and ultimately it'll be a good thing for sales. It will force sales to up its game.
Good point. So I had a question from the audience, Frank, from Ryan Sasana at Logisense. He was asking, how would you prioritize, I guess, business agility or efficiency for a quote to cash project if you had to pick one?
But if I'm asked a question about priorities, it's priorities versus what, right? The opportunity costs are a reality in any business. Executives like to deny it, right? They always like to say both and keep your options open, but that's not true. Opportunity costs are inevitable in any business. The money and time that you spend with account A is money and time not available for accounts B, C, D, etc. So depending on the business, my question is going to be, this priority versus what. That said, pricing, is probably the quickest builder or destroyer of value in most businesses. Again, you can see the data in the chapters about that in the book, but there's repeated studies that go back decades and are updated constantly, where something as small as a 1% price increase typically has a 6 to 10 times bigger impact on the bottom line for the typical Fortune 1000 company. So, usually pricing and the ability to get better at it, more refined, more focused, usually that's somewhere up there on the priorities of companies, but it's going to depend on, a variety of other things in the business model and the business strategy for me to say, Bruce, whether that's the number one priority or 2 or 3, but it's usually among the top 5 in my experience.
Great. And one other question we had, I guess, Frank, as a new sales leader of an organization in this new era of B2B, or as things are changing, and as they aren't, as we go back to some of the basics and things get rewritten, what blind spots would somebody have in an organization?
Well, I think I'd mention a couple. One is what I think was implicit in what I said earlier in answer to Daniel's excellent questions. By and large, I think it's a mistake to see online and offline as substitutes. That's not the reality in an omni-channel buying world. They're more often complements rather than substitutes. And I think that's where the action is in most sales organizations. The ability to integrate those two aspects of buying behavior in our go-to-market model. So again, it's not a digital eats physical world, but the second blind spot that I would mention, and this I think is general, underestimating the rate of change in business is always an issue. I always like to quote, Daniel quoted one of his mentors. I'll quote one of mine from years ago. We're discussing an important strategic decision, and he pointed out something very important. He said, Frank, with this decision, would you rather be a year too early, or a year too late in making the decision, right? So you could see what he was getting at. But I think while it's not a digital eats physical world, it would also be a blind spot to underestimate what that interaction between online and offline means for sales management requirements and sales leaders' careers. And then the third thing I would say, Bruce, in answer to your question, and this is sort of my generic advice to new sales leaders. And by new sales leader, I mean someone who, may be making that first move from the individual contributor to being the sales manager, or the sales leader who comes into a new organization, new branch, etc. Here I do suggest going back to basics. Make sure that you take performance reviews seriously, and make sure you do good performance reviews as opposed to what many sales managers do. And that's what I call drive-by reviews. And the reason that's important, and the pandemic, I think, has illustrated this, much of the really important information, especially in a lot of B2B businesses, much of the really important information about buyers, buying criteria, etc., is not in the CRM system of the company. You know, CRM systems are notoriously sloppy. There people input data with lots of different criteria, and they're usually ignored for lots of other reasons. Most of that important buying information is lodged in the head of the individual account manager. And it only becomes apparent in a good performance review. So when sales managers do sloppy reviews, they not only perpetuate a culture of underperformance, they inhibit the flow of vital information. And the pandemic has made this a bigger issue. The reality is the coronavirus is not an equal opportunity plague, right? There are some businesses, I'm going to use the gangster terminology, there are some businesses that have been whacked. I mean, I'm on the board of a business that depends on events. Our business didn't go through a gentle slope in March of 2020. It fell off a cliff. And I give this CEO tremendous credit for the pivots he put in place. There are other businesses, many technology businesses, where the pandemic has been good news. I mean, if we're perfectly honest, it's been very good news, right? So that is going to be true in your customer base. And again, it's the responsibility of the seller, not the buyer, to figure out who's barking up the right tree versus the wrong tree. Much of that data is really only visible, not through an AI system, but through doing good performance reviews with the person who's been calling on that account for some time. So those would be my three bits of advice, Bruce, about potential blind spots.
So, Frank, this has been awesome and really appreciate the time. Just one quick question for you. What's next? What didn't you put in the book that you wanted to put in the book? Or, and where, and the other thing that you mentioned, there's not a lot of good formalized training for salespeople, I guess, within the academic organizations of the world, like the higher learning.
Yeah.
But there are organizations like Pavilion or the Revenue Collective that seem to be doing some pretty cool things. What do you think about these sort of new sales-focused, ground up sales people driven organizations to drive sales knowledge?
I mean, a couple of things. One is, you're right, academic institutions don't do a particularly great job in this area. Partly it's because of, snobbishness, sales. Doesn't that sound like trade school stuff? But the real reason is because of a supply issue, not a demand issue, but a supply issue. Sales is not easy to teach. It's not easy to teach because, what's important in sales? Sales is almost by definition, what's important is what we associate with marketing. Do I understand buying behavior, economics, persuasion? I think one of the best sales books ever written was not written by a salesperson. It was written by Bob Cialdini at the University of Arizona about persuasion. It's also about psychology. That is not the way academics are trained. They're trained to know about their patch of land. They're not trained, in cross-disciplinary areas. And the third thing is that you may not want, you got to watch what you wish for. If you put in place a sales curriculum in a college, it's going to stay that way. And meanwhile, the market is going to change. All right. So I don't think we look to universities to solve the talent pipeline issue. When it comes to things like the Revenue Collective, et cetera, that's different. That is the intersection of vocational training and the real world. Question I raise about those organizations is, frankly, are they simply too tech-centric? And are they dealing in some sense already with the past? And what I mean by that is I don't think there's any particular mystery to inbound marketing or inside sales models at this point. I think the playbook about that has been written in a number of good books, etc. But precisely because that model is now domesticated and one could argue commoditizing, right? Look at what's required to generate leads in that model, and then look at how much money, how much increasing money you've got to pay for social media ads, etc. And the pandemic has just accelerated that expense. The real action, as always in sales, is changing. And I think the real action, as I said earlier, is integrating elements of that with sales models that, for good reasons, have always been account-based, but now we got to find ways to increase productivity. So while I think they, Bruce, are an improvement over letting, let's say, universities do it, creative destruction is a reality for them, just as it is for all businesses. And you know, my advice to your viewers is to figure out if they're still up to speed with what's happening, or if they're dealing with stuff that was really important 5 years ago, but hey, this, you know, I can do this a lot faster and cheaper on my own.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, Frank, I mean, you didn't answer what's next.
For me?
Yes.
Oh, what's next for me is lunch. I don't know. The last few years, I've sort of, for whatever reason, been on this once every 5 years with books. Every time I say it's the last one, we'll see. I do think, I must say, one of the things that really grabbed my attention in writing this book, and I think there's a lot more to explore with it. And by the way, I think it's an area where technology is the seller's friend if the seller knows what the hell he or she is doing. The ROI from sales training is notoriously disappointing, notoriously disappointing. And there are systemic reasons for that. I talk about that in one of the chapters of the book. But what I am seeing is a lot of really clever and smart ways that organizations are now using technology to do what I would call is the most important thing in sales in particular, and that is just-in-time learning. Salespeople are not studying for the final exam in my course, right? And yet most sales training is still this classroom-based training. I think there you're beginning to see, and will increasingly see, a big sea change. It's something I want to learn more about, and perhaps, Daniel, I'm not sure, write about as well.
I mean, just an anecdote there. We're seeing it increasingly with our technology customers because they offer so many products. Like, we have customers who have literally millions of SKUs. So how can a salesperson ever get up to speed? And if you talk about, turnover of product of 10% a year, that's right. That's hundreds of thousands of changing products on an annualized basis. Yeah. So just in time and the ability to filter that and help pull that information together insightfully. I mean, we tackle that somewhat, but the learning portion on how to pitch, how to, sell the value and understand the value to pass on is, great point.
No, I think you're right. And again, I think this is an area where the tools increasingly exist. But as always, it becomes then a management issue. How do we make this part of the cadence of what we do with our folks? And again, this is what managers get paid for. They get paid to do it better than the next guy or gal, and some are, in my experience.
Well, Frank, it's been a real pleasure. Really enjoyed the book. Look forward to following, hopefully, on the next one. And if anyone wants to reach out to you, just hit your webpage, or what's the best way?
Well, I mean, you can get the book in the various usual suspects. Amazon. You can go direct if you want it for your team. Go direct to the publisher. They will offer volume discounts that kick in at surprisingly low numbers, and they can also customize the book. I do have a website, but I have to confess I'm not exactly the best website maven. I post what I write, and that's about all I do there. So I'm not sure what else I can say about that, Daniel. But I do want to thank you. I want to thank you very, very much for hosting me on your podcast. I am a big fan of what ServicePath does, and the timing for this, from my point of view, couldn't have been better. So thank you
Awesome.
very much.
Great. Thanks, Frank.
Thanks, Frank.
Okay, Bruce, I think that's our wrap.